This presentation was recorded at mvc2. For more content like this, go to www.mvc2.com. JetBrains, the leading vendor of professional development tools, now offers a range of new products for .NET developers. In addition to ReSharper, the top-class productivity extension for Visual Studio, you can now use .cover to run coverage analysis for your applications, .trace to find performance bottlenecks, and use TeamCity and UTrack for a perfect combination of continuous integration and issue tracking software. Go to www.jetbrains.com for more information.
Hi, my name is Eric Sowell. You can find me on Twitter at Malioc and email eric.sowell@gmail.com. We're going to talk about ASP.NET MVC2 today from an introductory perspective. And this will be really for complete noobs. If you've done C# before, that will definitely help because we won't be discussing how to do C#. But we will be discussing ASP.NET generally a little bit, and MVC in particular. So nobody really likes a lot of slides at 8 o'clock in the morning, and so we are going to do a code-heavy introduction to ASP.NET, MVC, nuts to bolts, just started at the very early level. How do you use this framework to build websites? So let me share my Visual Studio. Okay, so here's Visual Studio. To start a new MVC project, once you have it installed, and if you have Visual Studio 2010 installed, you do, just go to File, New Project, ASP.NET MVC2 Web Application. We're going to call this Intro to MVC. Get started. The first option you get is if you want to create a unit test project, and we are. So let's take a look around at the basics of what you'll see with your brand new project. You'll see two libraries, Intro to MVC, that's my website, and then a test, which is my test website. Now, I'll go ahead and do this now because if I don't, I'll forget to do it later. For some reason, it isn't starting with a reference to my actual web project, and the test that it created would blow up without that. But I added it, so now I won't forget it. So here's your basic project, and this is what you see when you start. If you run the website, okay. And so you should be seeing a really plain grayish, bluish, and white website. That's the default template that you got. That's what you start with. It has two pages, About and Home. If you look back at your code, at your project, you'll see several different folders. There's a content folder for content like CSS and images. There's a controllers folder, which we'll talk about here in a second. Models, scripts, which contains all the JavaScript files that you want to use, and then views. And views are where your ASPX pages are. These are broken down into home, account, and shared right now, and just like always, we've got a master page. And so if you want to add scripts to it, which we'll go ahead and do because we're going to need them later, we're just going to add all of these in right here. You can do that, and now they're going to show up on all of your pages. So ASP.NET MVC as a framework is like a sister framework for what we have been doing for ASP.NET for years. With .NET 1, they released a new framework called ASP.NET. That's what actually I started web development on, and we did that for a number of years. With MVC2, with MVC, ASP.NET MVC, they came out with another web framework that runs on top of essentially the core ASP.NET. The core has not changed. There is still session, there is still request, there is still response, there is still caching. Typically what you think of the core basic functionality of ASP.NET is all still there. The difference between the two is on how you generate the HTML. With traditional ASP.NET, also called ASP.NET Web Forms, it's a very page-centric model. When you go to a URL, you're specifically going to a page. And on that page, you'll have web controls, and they'll have run at server on them. If you've done ASP.NET before, you are very familiar with that. With ASP.NET MVC, it's a little different. URLs don't map necessarily to pages. URLs map to spots in code. Now let's take a quick look at that. So if we go look at our web page right here, let's go to the About, because that makes it a little bit clearer. Everything in terms of your URL, or at least by default, is mapped to two things in code. The first thing is the controller. If you look at the URL here, I have home highlighted. What this means is this is going to what is called the home controller and the action called About. So if we look at code, here's our home controller. You're going to see a mapping between the first, the name of the controller minus controller at the end and the URL. So there's home here, and then there's home here. So home controller. And so the mapping for that maps this to this. Then the mapping of this maps to this method right here called About. This is all done through a file that, once again, if you're familiar with ASP.NET, you have certainly seen before, and that is the global ASACs. What this does is this sets up your routes here at the very beginning. We've got a default route that maps to controller, your URL to controller, then action, and then ID. If you don't specify controller, it's going to default to home. If you don't specify an index, it's going to default to index. Also, and I'll say this now, if anybody has any questions during this entire time or needs me to change any font sizes or screen resolution, please stop and ask a question. Eric will alert me if there are questions that I need to deal with. So look at that. I did get a request to change my screen resolution, so let me go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to change it to 1024 by 768. All right, so back to here. So that, for MVC, is how things work. These URLs no longer map to a page. That's what we're used to in ASP.NET Traditional. In ASP.NET MVC, those things now map to a place in code. Now this is very nice because this allows you, instead of, for example, whenever you go to a spot in code like this About, this allows you to return a page, or you can return JSON, or you can return a redirect, or you could return XML. You can do all sorts of things because you're not first hitting a .aspx file. The first thing that gets hit is this method. The first thing that gets hit is code. Therefore, you have a lot more flexibility in my mind on how to build your site and deal with your pages. Okay. All right. So that's how a URL gets mapped to a place in code. So let's create a new one. Let's actually create a new page called another page. So you do that by doing this, just creating another action. And so this action is just a regular method on a controller. The only thing that's unique about it is something called action result, and this is what you're returning. An action result is the base class for everything that you're going to want to return on any given request for ASP.NET MVC. And this action result, so is the base class for the view result, which is what you would return if you wanted to return a view, a page to look at. If you wanted to return JSON, you would return a JSON result. If you wanted to return a redirect to somewhere else on your site, you'd do a redirect to action. So that's the action result. If we want to create another page, all we have to do is create, first step, another page here. Let's go to it. Now, what you're going to notice is we're missing one thing, and then it's going to tell you what it is. The view, another page, was not found. So what happens is it sees this. It can find it. It sees, I understand that you're trying to get to another page, but you actually haven't created the HTML for that. So let's go to here and do that. And so just like the URL is broken down into a structure where you have the controller and then you have the action, your views are broken down also into a structure, and that you have your views and then you have your views for each of your controllers. And so we have our home controller here, and if you look at the error that it's saying is it says, okay, I looked for a view by that name because it saw the name on our method called another page. And I'm going to look for that name in the home controller spot in the views. So let's go ahead and put it there. Add view. Another page. So there it is. And that's how you get a page. It's relatively straightforward. Once again, it's more code-centric than the previous approaches in ASP.NET. First thing is you hit this method, and this method decides, hey, I want to return a view. Now, a view then returns HTML. If you want to return JSON, it looks something like this. See, it has this little helper method that returns what is called a JSON result. You can do that. You can return an action result. Excuse me. Sorry. You return a partial view, for example. A partial view is like a user control in traditional ASP.NET. It's a small chunk of HTML. You can return a redirect to action, which, let's say we want to return to the About page. We can do that. We can say About. Of course, this means the next time we view this page, we're just going to get redirected. But it's still good to see. So we're going to view that, and this is going to take us to the About page. There it is. Caught up. Okay. So that's basically how the URL routing works. Now let's talk about another thing. What we frequently need to do in ASP.NET, and really the main point of frameworks like ASP.NET, is we want to get data from our code to those pages, right? Because after all, if we didn't do that, we could then just use plain old HTML. So let's do that here in the context of another page. You can return data several different ways. For the sake of time, I'm going to show you what I think is generally the best practice in terms of how you get data from your code all the way up to your view. And so the first thing that happens is you hit this method right here. This allows you to then go and call your database or do whatever you need to do to gather all the data and then return it back. Now you can return it back in a loosely typed fashion with like a HTML, with like just a hash table if you want to, but that's not awesome. What we're going to do is we're actually going to create a class specific for this page. So let's create a new folder. We're going to call it View Models. And this is just a convention that I use. I like it because you can then follow the same convention that your other folder structures are using. So we're going to create View Models for Home, and I'm going to go create a regular old class. I'm going to call it Another Page View Model. For these classes that you're returning back to the view, you don't have to inherit from anything at all. We're going to create a property called date time, current time. Here's our Another Page View Model. For the page to know about that guy, you go to the page, and if you look at the very top, so we've got our regular old master page stuff that we're used to, these content placeholders. If you go to the very top, this thing inherits from system.web.mvc.view page. Now to pass that object back, we could do it without changing anything because of the dynamic type here. But instead, we're going to go in here and we're actually going to put this particular class. So what it's saying is we have a view page, and it's going to have this particular model. So now let's get into talk about the terminology. Model, view, controller. This is when we finally have all of the pieces. What is the model in this case? It's another page view model. What is the controller in this case? It's the home controller. And what is the view in this case? It's this page right here. So now we have all the pieces, model, view, and controller. And now let's give the model to the page. Another page view model. Okay. So we're going to set the current time to date time.now. And to pass this to the page, there's an overload here that takes a model. We're going to pass that back there. So when we get on the page, do this. You can do model.currentTime. Because the page is aware of what our model is, via this declaration right here, we can get nice IntelliSense on exactly what we passed back. So let's make sure that works. Let's see, another page. There we go. So we have our another page. We have, this is a plain old HTTP GET request. We're refreshing the page. We should get new time. It's 8:22:26, 8:22:29. So that's how you generally pass data from controller to page. Of course, the next thing we're going to want to do is pass data from page to controller, because if you're just displaying information, hey, that's cool, but you lose a lot of the functionality, of course, that what we do in web apps without being able to send in data. So let's mess around with that. Let's create a new page. And just so you can see how it's done, what we're also going to do is we're going to create a new controller just to show you how easy that is. And before I get going on that, I'm just going to go ahead and change my font size, because that's really big font at our current resolution. All right, so we're good to go. So let's create a new controller. Well, let's start here. First, what happens if you get a controller that it doesn't understand? We're going to call this new controller a cool new controller. And we're actually going to go to the index page. You're, of course, going to get just a regular 404 because it doesn't know it's there. So let's create a new controller called this. So if we go to controllers, we're going to add controller. Paste your name in. And I just called it add cool new controller. Let's not do that. Okay. A cool new controller. It already created this index action for us. Let's build. Let's go back. Of course, we're not going to get a 404 anymore. A cool new controller. Oh, sorry. Let's actually get a good name on that guy. A cool new, and then to index. And so now, of course, we're going to go back through the process we went through before. We don't have a page for that. So let's go to here, a cool new. So now we're going to have a cool new index page. So here's our page. This is the one we're going to put a form on to see how all of that interaction works. And let me reiterate for those of you who are new to the room this morning. If you have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A. Eric Hexter is watching that, and he will let me know if there's anything else, anything that needs to be answered, or if there's any issues that you're having. So feel free to do that. All right. So since we don't want our email popping up here, let me close that. Okay. Here's our page. Now, if we look at our cool new controller, we've got one basic method, that's the index. And what we want to do is, once again, we want to have this class, and we're going to call this like a strongly typed view model. This is what we call it. And so if you're tying your view to a specific class, like, for example, an index view model, which we're about to create, that's creating a strongly typed page. So let's go back to view models. Let's create a new folder, a cool new, add class, index view model. So let's do what we did last time. Let's take this, paste the namespace in. We also need the class name. Now this page is expecting us to pass in this model. And for our form, we're just going to have two fields, because we're going to keep it easy. We're going to have public string name, and we're going to have a public date, time, birth date. Two values, and that's it. So if we go back to a cool new controller, what we want to do is we can do this. We can say var vm equals new index view model. There's our using. We can say name equals Eric. Birth date equals new date time. let's see, 2000. 1975, I was born in November 20th, and so all of you keep track of that. So on my birthday, you can send me presents. So here's our view model. We're going to pass that back in. And of course, we're not doing anything yet on the page. And so if you go back here, we're going to get a whole lot of nothing, actually. It's just going to say index. So if we want to bring that in just like before, we could just do something like this. .name, and there's my name. But we're making a form. We're not doing this. Let me introduce you to something called the HTML helper. And so you could write all your HTML if you want to, just by hand. However, it's a lot easier to do something like this. And at least a little bit more readable. And you get some really nice framework stuff if you go this way. This is totally the way to go. So let's say you wanted to create a text box by this name. We're going to put in my model.name right there. That would give you an input form, specifically one of text, and it pre-populates the value in the model into that. That's the HTML helper. There's all sorts of different HTML helpers to get you going. The one we're going to start with is we're going to start with the begin form. So the way they did this is you're usually using, and what's kind of cool about this is whenever you close it, it closes the tag. So any elements we put in between the beginning and the end will actually be enclosed by the form tag. And so if we look to see what this is generating so far, we can find out some interesting stuff. So I removed my text box, but still the form is being produced here. So here it is right here. Form action equals a cool new / index method post. And so whenever you post this back, it's actually going to go back to our a cool new controller back here, which is not really what we want because this is doing a get. But by default, that's what happens. And I'll show you how very easily this is remedied here in just a second. And so that's what gets generated with a begin form. Now if we put in here an html.editor4, what this does is this takes a lambda expression which allows you to then pass in as a lambda expression the property name for the thing that you want to generate an editor for. And by editor, in this case, what we mean is text box, because it's going to look at the type of these and say, okay, well, I guess I named them both name. Copy paste there. It's going to look at the types of these, and it's going to say, okay, well, first one is a string. Obviously, we need a text box. And by default, it's going to do the same thing with date time because there's no special date time handling. So we're going to get 2 text boxes. That's kind of cool, but also a little lame. We don't have any labels or anything like that. The easiest way to do this, frankly, is to go with something that is new in MVC. And if we do this, we say editor for model. And what this will do is this will take your entire model that you've created, in this case only 2 properties, but it will take that, it will look at it and say, I see 2 properties. I see a string, which is your name, and I see a string, which is or a date time, which is your birth date. Well, I'm going to go ahead and just output everything there. And the bonus right here is it's also using the property names and creating labels for it. So now if we go back and look at the source, we're going to see something very different. So the action and the post, that hasn't changed in the form, because obviously nothing needs to yet. Then what it does is it creates a div called editor label, then label, and then you have a field, then label, and then field. And this makes up my entire view model. You can customize this, which we won't really talk about today at all, but you can customize this and say, okay, for a particular type, like date time, always show this type of editor, and that editor might be a jQuery date picker, for example. Or for any particular type, you can show really any custom HTML you want to do. And so if you have in one place in your app, you want to do a special input, okay, so maybe you don't want to go that route. But if you have multiple dates all over your app and you want to standardize, always using some sort of jQuery date picker, well, that's easy to do, because then you can just set that up as in your templating, and then that'll be available everywhere on the site for you to use. Now our form is almost finished, but not yet, because we need a way to submit back. So let's create a submit button, and then value equals post it. And this should be our brand new form. Post it. Cool. So now what we want to do is we want to go back to the new controller. And we have this method here for doing the get. We want to create a method for the post. It looks a lot like it, but it has one very important difference, and it is at least this. We're not passing in nothing like before. On the get, we didn't have any values we were passing in. But on the post, we actually want to pass back an index view model. Now this is one of my favorite magical parts of ASP.NET MVC. What it will do is it will look at a form post that you're sending in, and it will take all the values there, and it'll look at the method that you're hitting. It'll see that that method takes an object. And it'll say, okay, index view model. I have a form field called name. Do you have a property called name? You do? Sweet. And it'll assign it. And the same thing with birth date. That's very nice, because that means you don't have to do all your mapping between all your form fields and then the class that you're getting in. And this class that you're posting to doesn't have to be the same class as what you sent back before. All that really matters is that the names jive, and it can map those for you. This is called the model binding process. It's something you can tweak and really work with if you want to. Not what we're getting into, but this is the model binding process, and this I absolutely love, because by the time I get to my post, I'm not dealing with form elements. I'm not even dealing with individual controls and pulling out the values. That's what I had to do in the old school ASP.NET. I've got already just the birth date and the name. And so what are we going to want to do in this particular case? Well, normally you'd probably save your data when you validate it, and if it works, you'd save your data and then redirect somewhere else. So let's, instead of doing that, because we want to be able to make it back here fairly easily, actually let's do that. Let's return a redirect to action. We'll add something to our master page to be able to get us back here. So we're going to go back to the index page of the home controller whenever we post. Okay? Now, if we were to run this right now, which we will do just for funds, this is not going to work. And the reason why is the framework's going to get mad at me. And the reason why it's mad is the way it does its name lookup is it looks at index, and then it goes here and it says, okay, you have two index methods. Which one am I supposed to use? I'm rather angry at you. What it will do, and what you're supposed to do in this particular case, is if one method is for get and one method is for post, you can do this. You can say HTTP post. And this right here solves your problem, because it knows whenever it's doing a get, don't call the get method. Don't call the post method, call the get method. And whenever it's doing a post, it'll then call the post method. So here we go. We have our values, and we have our birth date. And in theory, when we post this, we're going to go back to the home page. Hey, look at that. We did. So now let's go back, because we're just getting started on this form. So here's our basic form. We've seen how do you serialize this thing and basically get it up to the form, and all it is just pass in this plain old object that you've created that you have control over. We've seen how to, that's an older page. We've seen how to create an editor for it, and this will basically create all the fields that you need. You can create them individually, or you can lean on this to make it a little faster for you. Here's how you create a form, and then we've seen how you pass it back down to the controller. Now let's talk about something that you're going to want to do a lot of the time, and that is validation. So let's say we want to make sure that name is always filled out. You could do it the manual way, where you're checking in here, where you can say, if string.is null or empty or white space, and then you can add errors. So you can say model state dot add model error, and you can give it the name of blah blah blah. Okay, that's painful. We don't want to do that. For ASP.NET MVC1, they had that, but they really didn't have baked in a really great validation system. I really like what they have baked in, though, for MVC2. And it's all based on the data annotation attributes. So let's say we want to make name required. Let's see, we don't need that anymore. So let's go to our index view model. Put required on here. Bring in our namespace. There we go, required. And now that little bit is going to be required for us whenever we post the form. Now, of course, we're still redirecting to action no matter what we do. So let's wrap this. We're going to say if model state dot is valid. So this says if you've passed all your validations, then return a redirect to action. Otherwise, return the view again and then pass the view model back. And so if you didn't do it quite right, give the view the data back that it wants. And don't redirect. So let's do that. Rear into the page. Let's take my name out. Let's post it. Are we going to redirect? We certainly shouldn't. And we get this right here. So this is one of the reasons why you would want to use one of the HTML helpers instead of making all of your HTML yourself. Notice whenever you have an error, what it does for you. If you look at the source, you'll see that down here for name, you'll see, oh, that's just showing it again. What it's doing essentially is it's adding classes to this. And so this basically turns your input into pink because it's in an error state. And also, it gives you this default error message of the name field is required because you're using the helpers. If you're not using the helpers, you're not going to get all of this. Now, another thing you can also throw on the page is if you want to use a validation summary, you can do that. So let's repost this. And there you go. Now you have your nice little validation summary if you want. Let's get rid of that guy. Okay, so that's how you do basic validation. Now, one thing that would be really nice, especially for this type of validation, is if you could do this validation on the client side. So if you notice, it's actually doing a post back to do that validation. So we've already imported our scripts, and so actually we've done all the setup we need to actually do this client-side validation. So all you have to do is you have to come in here, and you have to say html.enable client validation. And what this will do for the built-in framework bits for validation is it will then take the ones that it can and turn them into client-side validation. And so if you require data validation, like you want to make sure if someone's submitting a new handle that it's not duplicated somewhere else in your system, that won't work in this particular scenario. However, for things like required, that you can check to make sure something's filled out, that's actually easy to do. So we should, in this case, not actually be doing a postback when we're not, because that client validation has been moved up to the client instead of actually being performed on the server only. And that's all just by doing enable client validation. I think that's kind of nice. So that's the basic validation there in that sense. And there are other things that you can do with these data annotation attributes. If you go back here, we can say instead of, if you look at the form birth date, no spaces, we can go back here and we can say display name. We're going to call this birth date. And so this is another bit of where you have a little bit of control over your view model, even if you're doing just a plain old editor for model where you're not actually specifying the individual fields. And so you'll see that the birth date now has been split up into whatever I said in the display. And so what you've got here then is a very nice situation in terms of setting up your forms for viewing and your data on your screens for viewing, because you have this nice class that you can put data in and then pass it back. What this also gives you, and this is what we're going to do right now, is this makes it really easy for you to test. And so one of the nice things they wanted to do with ASP.NET MVC is make it more testable than web forms. If you've been doing ASP.NET, as I have for years, you know it is testable. You can do it. It's just not always easy. And so this is actually really easy. So let's create a test. So let's close down some things here in our primary project and go to our tests. So let's create tests for the cool new controller. So we're going to create a new test, basic unit test, a cool new controller test. All right, we want to test the index method. And I'm going to want to essentially check that my name and birth date gets filled in for this form whenever it gets posted back, or excuse me, sent up for initial rendering on the page. So here's how you do that. First of all, you're going to need the controller, right? So you just new it up like any other class. There we go. Wherever cool new controller. Controller.index. And so this is the method. And this is what's really nice about being outside of page load and page init and create child controls and ensure child controls, the things we've been dealing with ASP.NET traditionally understood, is we've got just regular old methods, which means for the most part you can test them just like regular old methods. So here's our index method. If you call that, it's going to return a result. Now, the results we return are action results. And so we're returning here what would be then just a generic action result. It could be a redirect result, it could be a view result, or whatever. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and cast it as view result. And so this is going to then come back that way. So I'm going to say cert.isNotNull result. Because, as you probably know, whenever you have an object that you're going to cast to another with the as operator, if that object is not of that type, you're going to get a null. Otherwise, you're actually going to get an instance that's cast for you. And so we're going to check to make sure that it's not null, because if it's null, that means I returned something other than a view result. So we're going to check that. We're going to say expected a view result. Okay. And so let's run this before we check our actual data. I use testdriven.net, and I've got Control-T mapped to run test. And if you haven't used testdriven.net, I highly recommend going out and downloading it and using it. So I've got Control-RT mapped to this. We can see that it passed there. One passed. Fantastic. Now what I'm going to do is I now want to check on the view model. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to say var vm equals result dot, and now we have access to all the properties of the view result. And so there's this view result property called view data, and on it is a model. This is the model that you're passing back. And so I want to get back my index view model. Bring in my namespace. There we go. So this will then get me to my view model. And then once again, it's probably not a bad idea for me to assert that this is not null, expected a view model. All right, now what I want to do is I'm going to check vm.birthday. Actually, let's turn this around. Cert.is, let's see, r equal. So I'm going to get this, I'm expecting Eric. I'm going to misspell it here so we can see the error. I'm expecting Eric with a C, or Eric with a Q in this case. So let's get the name. Let's run this guy. Testdriven.net. This is going to show up then in the output, and it's going to say expected Eric, but we actually returned Eric. And so this would be how you would test a get method. And this get method, you're going to say, I expect it to return X data. If you can assume that, then this is super easy. Or in cases where you have it dynamic, and we're going to talk about this more in my testing session later today. But let's say you have something dynamic, then you can use some sort of inversion of control principle, whether it's a container or just doing dependency injection. You can then say, okay, returns X values, and then in your test, you can test to make sure you got those values, just like we're doing right now. And so then I'm going to say sort.art equal, new date, time. Let's see if I remember my birthday. Wrong birth date. Okay. And we want a message here because if you don't have messages on each of them, you may not be sure exactly which one broke. So wrong name. So let's run this And now we have a nicely tested get method here on our cool new controller. So that's how you would test this one. That one's fairly straightforward. This one is also a little bit more fun because you have two potential results. Let's go back here and now create a new one. So create a new method, public void index. We're going to call it post invalid data returns view. And so if we're posting invalid data, we're not going to return a redirect, right? So we're going to do this. We're going to say if it is marked as invalid, then return a redirect, return the view, not a redirect. And so let's just take these guys. We're going to once again expect a view result. And notice here, for the post, what we want to do, we have two overloads, right? So we want to pass in the new index view model. This is, of course, not valid. Now, here's something to watch out for with the new validation system. As far as I know, there's not a very clean way of being able to invoke the validation system directly on an object. I could be wrong on that. It used to be the case that that wasn't true. However, we're not really here to test that the ASP.NET Teams validation stuff works. That's not our goal. I actually assume it probably does. It certainly seems to every time I check it. So we're not actually going to test that. We're just testing our logic. So what we want to do is we want to say controller.modelState.add. Let's add a model error. We're going to say some name, and we're going to say you did something wrong. What this is going to do is this is going to trigger back here in our action. This is going to trigger this to false. It's because we added this model error. So we're going to say, okay, index, pass in this value. It's going to return a view result. We're going to search that is not null, our view result. Now that should pass because that's actually the logic we just had. And that's all I'm going to do there. For the redirect to action, you can do this. So we're going to post valid data, and it's going to return a redirect to route result. All right. Test method. All right, so if we take this bit right here, just as is, and of course take out this guy, because we actually want to make sure we're not forcing a failure in this case. And instead of view result, we're turning a redirect to route result. We're then going to run this, and we're not finished with this. There's more to this test I want to add, but that already passes, right? So assuming validation works, it's going to return back a result, and that result is going to be a redirect to route result. Now, in this particular case, let's make sure in our test that we're actually redirecting to the correct place. So let's do a assert.r equal. We're going to assert that the result.route values. So these are the values that are ultimately coming back for it to decide which route to go to. We're going to pick the action. So let's just string that guy. So this is what is actual. We're supposed to put our expected first. So we'll go back and do that. Also, I'm going to go into lower this. I typically do this in my test because you know what? It doesn't really matter what the casing on it is. So we're going to say, we're going to go back to the index action of the home controller, if I recall correctly. So that's the action. In terms of controller, we're going to do this. So let's see if that works. Sweet. And so with your redirect to actions and your redirect to routes, you can not only get back that you actually intended to do a redirect to route, but you're also going to get back something where you can check the actual values. And this is where I really like the action result. In traditional ASP.NET, if you wanted to redirect, let's say you're in a button click and they did something horribly wrong and you want to redirect them to a page that says you did something horribly wrong, you're going to do response.redirect and send them there. How would you automate the testing of that? Certainly not easy. Well, in a UI test, perhaps, if you're running the browser, that's easy. But just in terms of automated unit testing in code, not remotely simple at all. What they did with MVC is they went with an entirely different direction on how to do this whole what is your framework doing versus what is your intent on doing. By separating the actual doing of the thing into the intents of doing the thing, you get a great deal more testability. So what I mean is, when you look at your controller and you're saying redirect to action, you're not saying at this point in code, redirect. What you're doing is you're returning a redirect result to the framework, and then the framework redirects for you. What that allows you to do is then test this method and check that you actually told the framework what you intended to do. Same thing with the view. You want to test the HTML rendered by a view whenever you render a page, you can do it, but that's kind of a little bit of a pain. However, if you want to just check to make sure when you view a view that you've gotten certain bits of data, well, that's really easy in this case because you're not returning whenever you test it. You don't have to parse through HTML to find out that everything was in that. All you have to do is you go back here and do exactly what we just did, and that is you get the result, which is a view result, and then you can interrogate the view model to make sure it has everything in it. This is a much better way of making things testable. Of course, with the original web forms, that wasn't really one of their primary goals, or goals perhaps at all, in building the framework, because it's not out of the box just all that easy to test a great deal of things. But with mvc2, this was a new focus for them, and so they did it, and frankly, I really like how they did it. It worked out really well, and it does make the testing much easier. Now later on, we're going to get into this testing quite a bit more. I'm doing a session, I believe it's at 11 o'clock, that is entirely devoted to testing. And so we're going to go through this again for people who haven't been to the session, who haven't been to this. And then we're going to go into some other things that I typically end up doing in my projects to make things more testable. And so if you want to learn more about how to do this, where you can really pimp out your testing, come back to that session and we'll be discussing it there. So we're down to 5 minutes, and so I want to give you a minute to ask any questions that you may have. It can be specifically about what we discussed today. It can be more general about the framework. So if you want to go ahead and ask those questions, why don't you go ahead and do that now. And one other point, I'll go ahead and make this while you're thinking about questions that you want to ask, and if you have them, then for Eric to gather them for me. Another nice feature about this framework is there's various pieces of it that are pluggable. What this means is you can go in and you can change how the framework works by, instead of using the default version of something, to be able to inject something else and use it instead. I'll give you an example of how I do that. I use a project called Structure Map. Some of you may be familiar with that. I do recommend looking into it. I like what it does. I like what it does for helping me build my apps. It sure helps me put my dependencies together. And so it really helps me keep control of basically collecting all of the code that I need to collect it for a controller, given controller to run. It's also really good for testing because it decouples the instantiation of all the classes you need from the controller and puts them somewhere else, and so you can make it more testable. And so the way that I put Structure Map into MVC is I replace what is called the controller factory. So the controller factory is what takes this URL here, looks at this and says, okay, you want a cool new? I'm going to find a cool new controller, and I'm going to instantiate that guy and give it to the framework for it to use. What I do is I use, instead of using the default controller factory that does that, is I use Structure Map. And what it does is that will then create the controller and fill in all of that controller's dependencies. And so let's say I have 5 or 6 different data proxies of some sort within that class. It'll fill in all of those for me. And you get all the benefits then of both testability and also just composability of putting together your app without actually much hassle at all. And so that's one way in which the framework is extensible. So you can do that with that and with a number of other pieces. There's other view engines that you can use. If you don't want to look at the alligator tags, if you're not pretty happy with that, well, fine. You can use the Spark view engine. Or you can use the Razor view engine, which will be coming out soon. There will be a presentation on that later. I'll definitely be attending that one. So it's an extensible framework, so you can go in and tweak exactly what you want to do. So anyway, any questions at this point? So here's one from Mike Hamilton. I thought for mvc2 I'll paste this on the screen so everybody can see it. So here's this question. I thought for mvc2 this syntax should be used as it HTML codes it and it does it. That's actually a fine point. I am so used to not using that I usually as my first default don't do it. But that is a good point. By default, when you've got content coming out of your code, this is your view model, for example, if you put it out to the screen like we did here, it's not going to HTML encode it. However, in this particular scenario, it will. Now, to me, this is more important, not in the form field situation that we're doing, but in the view pages. So let's go to our view page that we have, and I'll just show everybody how that works. If we go to home, another page. So let's go here, home/another page. We were outputting a little bit of data here from model current time. So you can HTML encode this and get a little bit better security. This is actually a good idea. Now if you re-render the page, for what we're doing, it doesn't make a bit of difference at all. As a general rule, this is probably a better idea. And last I heard with Razor, the other view engine that's coming out, everything is HTML encoded by default. And you have to turn it off for specific elements if you want to do that. So that's something that's actually going to be nice, because sometimes, just like I did, you'll forget to do that. And that's actually a fine point. How to test a JSON result? Well, that's actually one thing that's very nice, because it's just as easy to test as a view result. So let's do public void foo. Since we're not actually returning a view result, you'll just have to bear with me here. Actually, let's go ahead and do it. So we have controller.getMeJSON. All right? Of course, that doesn't exist. We'll go create it. New JSON result. Excuse me. Return JSON. So this helper method is good for returning a JSON result. We're going to pass back a foo. All right? If you go back to your test class right here, what you're going to do is you're going to do exactly what you did with the view result. Actually, you're going to say as JSON result equals, and we'll go over this again later. But so what we're going to do is we're going to cast the getMeJSON, which returns an action result. We're going to cast that guy as a JSON result. And then we're going to search that is not null on that. And then we're going to have a data. So then what we can say is we can say, okay, we're going to say to string this guy. So let's see. Search.rEqual foo. That's what we expect. That's what we're getting back. Let's run this, and we test. Of course, that's not the TDD workflow. That's not the red-green refactor. But that's essentially how you would do it. You would just cast it as a JSON result. You have the value that you want in this data bucket right here. And this guy's just an object, which kind of makes sense in this case. And so what's happening here on the controller side of things is whatever gets passed into this will be serialized into JSON for you. So you don't actually have to worry about that. And the same thing is true whenever you have a form that you post it. The model binder will still pick up everything from a normal post, even when you're doing your, for example, an AJAX post from jQuery. It'll pick that up, and you can still get this nice model binding workflow and this automatic JSON serialization for you. And so, you don't have to pass in a string. You could have a class, var pm equals new index view model, and it would be able to take that index view model and then serialize it. Okay, thanks everybody.
This presentation was recorded at mvc2. For more content like this, go to www.mvc2.com.